Hello, I'm Ollie. This is Criminally, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, pulp, it's an executioner doubleheader. So I did a review of the first executioner book, War Against the Mafia, quite early on in the lifetime of my channel. And apart from in my monthly wrap-ups and things like that, I've not really talked about the executioner books since. And I certainly don't intend to review every one individually because they're fairly throwaway, to be honest with you. I love them, but they're fairly throwaway, and I think it would get a bit dull. But there were two that I've read recently that I really wanted to talk about because they were both fun. So those two are Assault on Soho, which is Executioner Book 6. So in theory, I'm doing a read through from 1 onwards, but there are 400 plus books in the series, so I'm probably never going to read all of them. And whilst I've got quite a lot of them, I have got some gaps. And given that I'm on my book buying ban, and given that, let's be honest, you only need so many executioner books, I'm probably going to skip over the gaps when I get to them rather than trying to fill them. But anyway, this was one I was really looking forward to reading because it's set in London. And then the other book I'm going to talk about is Night Kill, which is Executioner Book 124, which was written in the late 80s and is about Mac Boland going after Satanists, which just that hooked me, and I had to read this book, even though I went from book 6 to book 124. And the reason I've chosen these two to talk about together is because they both do something I really love, which is exploit a current trend or a contemporary trend to when the books came out. So, as I said, this one came out kind of late 80s at the height of the satanic panic in the States, and definitely, exploits people's concerns about cults and Satanism and things like that. And Assault on Soho, being one of the early books, came out kind of in the early 70s and really exploits that kind of swinging London vibe that was around at the time. It feels a lot like an Austin Powers story at times. It's quite amusing. So I love that kind of thing in books and movies as well. So it's probably more well known as The Thing in movies. So people talk about exploitation movies, and I think people often think that the term exploitation movies talks about the people, like the actors in the film, being exploited, but it's not that at all. It's about films that are made to exploit a current trend. Like the wave of killer shark movies that came out after Jaws, for example, or the boom in trashy, low budget sci-fi space operas after Star Wars came out. And these books both do that, and do it really entertainingly. So I've always been intrigued and amused by kind of exploitation books and movies, as I say, and particularly was interested recently to see that there were a number of books that came out or that were either released or republished to cash in basically on the coronavirus pandemic. There was a book called Plague by Graham Masterton, which got republished, which was okay. Did have one very, very dodgy scene in it. There's a book by Peter May called Lockdown, which is fantastic, which is a book that had never been published because nobody thought, like the publishers thought, that it was such an incredible, as in not credible, story that no one would publish it. But basically it's a detective story that's set during a lockdown when all the streets are deserted, and in that book I think it's bird flu that's caused the lockdown rather than coronavirus. But it's a very good book, and clearly quite prescient because it was a good few years before the current pandemic. And then also there was, and now I can't remember what it was called, but there was that Dean Koontz one. Is it Eyes of Darkness? I don't think it is. But there's a Dean Koontz one that talks about Wuhan, talks about a plague from Wuhan, which everyone was going on about being, predictive of coronavirus. And then also a book I've talked about on the channel, so the Phoenix books, where the author, so these were like trashy pulp adventure books written in the 80s, where the author went back and added coronavirus into them and then republished them, which is an interesting tactic. So yeah, I whilst it's kind of appalling that people are making money out of tragedy, I also find it fascinating, and an interesting element of, you know, kind of modern capitalism, really. And I suppose not modern, I suppose it's always happened. I'm sure there are a wave of books and movies about boats going down after the Titanic sunk. So yeah, so let's talk about these two. So I'll start with this one. So Assault on Soho basically has Matt Bolan in London, in a very swinging London. And let me read you a description from the book, which I thought was great. So here was London nightlife in all its late 20th century splendour and squalor. It was Greenwich Village and Fisherman's Wharf rolled into composite, an assortment of joints, dives, stripperies, fish and chip houses, fine restaurants of all nations, and the ever-present discotheques and go-go palaces. Bolan strolled casually through the neon jungle, orienting himself and getting the feel of the area, walking in an atmosphere of far-out jazz, electronic flashes, and the jarring crescendos of rock amplitudes. He found Soho Psych, which is a nightclub that features in the book. He found Soho Psych precisely where the matchbook advertising promised he would, on Frith, just off the square, snuggled in between a Pakistani restaurant and a rundown theatre whose billboards offered the best in London flesh. So yeah, and as with the previous 5 books in the series, this is quite different from all the ones before it. So this one feels a lot more like a mystery. So basically, Bolan ends up in London. He gets picked up almost straight away. So by this kind of swinging young miniskirted woman driving a sports car, when Bolan's being chased by some thugs. She picks him up and takes him to this weird club where all the decor is kind of incredibly sexualized, to the extent that the doors look like vaginas. So there's a line in here that's something like, you know, something like Bolan emerged from between the labia or something like that, which I thought was amazing. So he gets picked up with this woman, and there's loads of stuff. So the mob find out he's in London, the mob in America, and they're kind of sending people over to get him. But there's also loads of weird shit going on in London, and there's a series of deaths that happen around this sex club he's staying in. And you never really know until right at the end whether it's the mob or other people that are doing it. And there's this whole espionage angle as well. So yeah, as I said at the start, with the mix of kind of espionage and swinging London, I think it's trying to be a James Bond book, but it reads a lot more like Austin Powers. It's incredibly silly and very entertaining. Not the best of the Bolan books I've read so far, but it definitely has its moments, and it's enjoyably tense and violent towards the end as well, as they tend to be. And then this one, so I was really looking forward to this one, and it was a bit of a letdown, to be honest with you. I've read the back out before in other videos, but I'll do it again because it's so good. So suspicions about the existence of a nationwide satanic mafia which deals in drugs, pornography and contract killings are growing. The atrocities committed by psychopaths and serial killers are being linked to these devil worshippers, and so far no hard evidence exists to indict the cult. The executioner is asked to find some. Matt Bolan follows a grisly trail of human sacrifices left in the wake of a touring heavy metal rock band rumoured to be involved in the black arts. So what was good about this book? So the first third of this book is actually really quite good. So whereas in these ones, it's just Bolan against the mafia, by this stage in the series, he's kind of working with the FBI. They call him Striker. That's his kind of code name. So he's working with the FBI, but very much kind of disavowed by them if anything goes wrong. So in this one, he hooks up with this guy who's an expert in Satanism and investigates cults and things like that. And some of the detail that's in here is really quite interesting. So there's loads of stuff about Charles Manson and about David Berkowitz, the son of Sam. And having watched a couple of, so I read quite recently Helter Skelter and watched Sons of Sam, the Netflix documentary about Berkowitz, which was really interesting. And there's a lot of detail about them and their kind of potential links to Satanism. And when I looked up the author, so as always, these are badged as being by Don Pendleton, but actually it's by a guy called Mike something or other. Get his name now. Mike Newton. When I looked at Mike Newton, he's written loads of the executioner books, but also written some non-fiction books about, you know, cults and things like that, and Satanism. So he clearly knows his stuff. So that, I thought, gave it a really interesting setup. And then you get this heavy metal band as well, who are called Apocalypse, who hold like black masses at the end of their concerts and things like that. So you get some detail about them, which is quite interesting. And they've got this kind of enigmatic producer or manager guy who's working with them, who's true Satanists, whereas the band just kind of play at Satanism for effect. But what's happening in the book is every town they play a concert in, a young girl goes missing at the same time and winds up dead. And there's this gang of Satanists kind of following them around, sacrificing people. And what the author does that's quite interesting is he also throws in the religious right. So there's like a religious preacher, like a TV evangelist kind of guy, who's basically just out to make money and is exploiting these murders and the kind of Satanist side of the heavy metal band to get more money from his followers, basically. And I thought that was quite an interesting balance, that it wasn't just about Satanism, it was about the flip side and how how conservative Christianity can be exploitative as well. So that was all quite interesting. What it lacks, and there's quite a good mystery, you know, them working together to find out, you know, what's happened to these girls. And there's also like a white witch character, a Wiccan practitioner who gets involved as well, who Bolan, in quite a strange scene, goes to this kind of like witchy ceremony with her in the woods, and they end up making love in the moonlight, and it was quite bizarre. So all of that's quite good, and it's quite tense. What it lacks as an executioner book is action. There's not very much action in it at all. There's one scene, kind of about a third of the way through, where Bolan takes down a child pornography ring, and you know, with extreme prejudice, shall we say, which was quite entertaining. And then at the end of the book, there's a good shootout. But in between, it's much more of a detective novel than it is like an action novel. So I was a bit disappointed by that, and I felt that the kind of horror elements of it, so that, you know, the kind of satanic sacrifices and things like that, I would have liked to have seen a bit more of that, to be honest with you, because it's all about the, when you read a book like this, you want a bit of horror and a bit of action. So it was definitely lacking in those. But anyway, 2 executioner books, both fun reads. So I would recommend either of them if you like this sort of thing. But yeah, as I say, I'm not going to review all the executioner books I read, because trust me, you'd get bored. But yeah, if you fancy two ones which are a bit different, I would recommend both of those. So yes, that's that video done. Thank you very much for watching. As always, really appreciate your time. Keep safe, keep well, and I will speak to you all again soon. Cheerio.